Hmm. So what we're going to do tonight, a little different, is for those of you who come to this regularly, is we're going to interrogate one another and ask some questions rather than having presentations. So we have some questions that we're going to ask of Renee and Maria, and then we're going to turn it over to you to ask questions. They can be anything relative to media literacy, whatever this topic means to you, because it's a big one and an important one. So unless there are no fundamental questions before we begin, I'm going to start. So to each of you, Renee and Maria in that order, I think, how do each of you approach issues of media literacy in your work? Renee. You're on mute.
Oh, yes, Renee, please unmute yourself. Good idea. Um, I got interested in media literacy when I was very young. I found a magazine that it was called Media and Values. And it was produced by an organization called the Center for Media Literacy in Los Angeles. And it had scholarly ideas about media, technology, and society, but written in a very accessible journalistic way. And I just thought, oh, this is so smart, right? Trying to build a bridge between, scholarly perspectives on media and society and like ordinary people, mothers, fathers, grandmothers, grandfathers. I just thought that was so cool. And when I went to my PhD advisor at Harvard University, I said I wanted to write about this new thing. Maybe it was called media literacy. He said, "Oh, no, 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 no. You can't write about that. There's no scholarly literature on that topic." And it was like, but that's why I want to do the research. So for 30 years or more, I have been exploring what does it mean to help people of all ages engage in critical thinking about media, technology, and society. And particularly, what does that look like in elementary and secondary school? And so over the last 30 plus years, I've made more site visits to schools around the country and around the world than I can count. I've had the opportunity to train teachers at all levels how to implement media literacy education in the classroom, and even to build a global community because, it turns out that media literacy is really an expanded way of thinking about literacy. If literacy is reading and writing, right, speaking and listening, then those skills are needed more than ever when it comes to media, TV, newspapers, journalism, social media, the internet, and now AI, right? So thinking about media literacy as critical thinking skills and communication skills that relate to all the different forms of media that we have in our world. That's how I found my way into media literacy. And just as I think I started to understand it, well, new things would come along and change. And now here I am studying AI literacy, right? So this topic just never gets old.
I love that you said that, Renee, because one of the reasons I became a professor is because I wanted to stay up to date. I love media as a consumer, as a producer, both sides of it. And I thought, you know what? If I'm a professor, I have to keep learning. I'm always going to be on top of it. I didn't expect things to speed up so quickly, though. So I didn't expect I was going to be doing so much studying when I started this. But I started as a journalist. I'm from the Dominican Republic. I was a journalist in the Dominican Republic before I got into public relations. And I believe that, news and information are vital to democracy. I come from a developing country and a young democracy. I grew up believing in those values. I really appreciate my parents for that. And then when I got into public relations, the area that I was working in first was public diplomacy, so foreign government to local in another country, and development communication, which today we call communication for social change. So it was so empowering and beautiful and cool to see how we could use the same tools that you can use to sell shampoo we can use to get people to eat better or wash their hands or prevent disease or even change culture when there are some cultural practices that are hurting you or hurting your society. Today, as an educator, I'm a PR educator, and I just want to make sure that my students know the responsibility that they have in their hands when they become PR practitioners. I want them to be critical thinkers and I want them to be very aware of the influence that our field has on people. And that's why I care about media literacy and about information integrity.
Thank you. I think that's a good segue to the next question for you both. What is the state of media literacy in the high school and college level? Maria, you want to kick that off since you were sort of on that topic to start with?
Sure, I can't speak to the high school level, sadly. I don't have any experience with high school. At the college level, I would say that we don't teach media literacy in one single class, especially in public relations and advertising. We see it a little bit like we see ethics. It's one of those skills that you have to acquire across all the different ways that you study the field. However, we do have an ethics specific class, right? So I think we should have a media literacy specific class. Our students, in my personal experience, are very excited by new tools to the degree that sometimes they don't stop to think about the implications of these new tools or how the best use. So that's kind of our role as professors to help them with that. I guess I'll stop there. Thank you.
Renee?
Okay, so um, we know a lot more about the state of media literacy in American public schools than we used to. I'm going to share my screen with you and show you. There's a really great organization called Media Literacy Now. They're a policy organization that advocates for media literacy and tracks state bills and state laws that have mandated media literacy. And as you can see, Tennessee is on the map. Ooh, yeah. So that is really wonderful. Now, one of the things that needs to be said, so in about, I think this is about 22 states right now, is that these laws are they're differ from state to state. And in a way, we have like a little laboratory going on. Just each state that has implemented media literacy instruction is doing it a little bit differently, and that creates an opportunity. So for instance, up there in Northwest Washington, you see up there in the north, their approach to media literacy is pretty robust. They have a state coordinator, they have money for training teachers, and they have a statewide organization of educators. So that's incredible, right? In Illinois, they mandated that media literacy be taught as a unit of study in high school, right? And that law just came into being just in the last year. So we'll see, because their law doesn't have any new money, any support for teachers, no, special training, but they still mandate that it be taught at high school, that before students graduate, they get exposure to media literacy through a unit of study. So will that go well? We're not sure. Same with New Jersey and Delaware. Those are pretty strong. Those states strongly integrate media literacy into English language arts education, social studies education, and health. So I would invite anyone you want to learn more about what's happening in Tennessee, download the media literacy policy report and you'll get a detailed narrative about what the actual state of that law is in your state. So I'd say there's been more progress, Marilyn, in advancing media literacy at the state level since 2016. The last 10 years, in a way, fake news has been very good for media literacy because it's a raised awareness about what it means to be a critical thinker in an age where disinformation is rampant.
That's a good segue to the next question, because we're repeatedly exposed to misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda, especially online. What are some of the commonly used tools? And is there any way to, as a sideline to that question, any way to have a definition of propaganda? That's a big question.
People have been, Maria, it's true, isn't it? People have been debating the meaning of propaganda for well over 100 years. In
Yep.
public relations, in your field, the founder of public relations wrote the first book. It was called Propaganda. It was written in 1928. His name was Eddie Bernays. And can you believe it, Maria? You'll never believe it. I had the opportunity to meet Eddie Bernays when I was a young assistant professor. He was like in his early 90s, but he was sharp as a tack. He said propaganda is essential for democracy. Now, that's not something you hear every day, is it? Because the word propaganda kind of just seems like a bad, dirty word. But Maria, why did Bernays think propaganda was essential for democracy?
It's a way in which we share our ideas and our ideals, and we can all participate in the marketplace of ideas, right? So propaganda allows us to be informed, to be persuaded, but also to become active participants in the public debates that make a democracy. I hope that I did him, justice.
That was absolutely beautiful. It turns out propaganda doesn't work without your consent, right? So, like sometimes people think it's like some kind of thing, like a drug, you can inoculate someone and boom, they're, indoctrinated. But no, propaganda only works if it works, if it resonates with your deepest hopes, fears, and dreams, right? So propaganda is intentionally designed messages that try to influence public opinion, including attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. And that means propaganda can be found in advertising, in public relations, in government, in news and journalism, in education, and in entertainment. And if I were to even say even further, I could say, and religion. Right? So propaganda is everywhere. It's been part of how humans influence each other and form coalitions and build societies. 2,500 years ago, the Greeks were well aware of propaganda, and they recognized its power, right, as a form of influence in society. So today, it's sometimes hard to recognize because, well, because everything's so blurry, right? Is it informative? Is it entertaining? Is it persuasive? It's all of those things all the time, right? So that's what makes propaganda a little bit hard to spot sometimes.
Renee, in your book, you listed several devices. And I'm just curious if you could, I'm going to list them for the audience, but which of these do you think is the most insidious or misunderstood? Or which one would you most like to talk about? Why don't we do that? Name calling, bandwagon, glittering generalities. I just love that for the ananatia. Card stacking, plain folks, flag waving, and testimonial. Any of those you want to draw a circle around and talk about?
I'm going to talk about name calling, but before I do, I want to talk about the list itself because how it got created is so fascinating. And many of us in the room remember learning about those propaganda techniques when we were in school. Well, raise your hand if those are familiar to you, that you learned about them in school. Absolutely. That list of propaganda techniques was developed by a man named Clyde Miller in 1937. Guess what was happening in 1937, right? Well, anti-Semitism was rising in the United States and around the world. Hitler was in power, and radio was the new technology. And people were discovering all kinds of ways to persuade people with the sound of their voice, right? Radio advertising was becoming just phenomenal, and radio politicians were being important. Remember the fireside chats that were being used. So Clyde Miller was a journalist who took basically his reading of the ancient Greeks, right, who were writing about propaganda 2,500 years ago, and he came up with very catchy names for these techniques, right? Name calling, the Greeks called it ad hominem, right? He came up with catchy names for these techniques. And in a way, his choice of those 7 reflected the fact that the dominant media of the time in 1937 were the newspapers and radio. Like those media were like everything in terms of how people got information, entertainment, and persuasion. Today, we get information from sponsored content, from clickbait, from memes, from, all kinds of different things. But some of the powerful uh, key forms of persuasion are still relevant. And so that's why I'm picking name calling. It turns out that the most powerful element of propaganda is the power of language to shape reality, right? Because when you call somebody a liar, right, then that just shifts your whole head in around. And when you call someone beautiful, well, they just look better, don't they? Language shapes reality. And so strategic use of language has since forever been used to define who we should love and who we should hate. Have you ever heard that phrase? One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right? So those are names used to shape people's perception of reality. So name calling, that's my favorite one.
And a frequent one. I know those went by really quickly. Maria, if there's one of those that you wanted to talk about at all? Don't feel obligated.
I did want to talk very briefly about testimonials, because
Okay.
testimonials are, I'm going to be 100% honest and say my favorite. Um, they are super, super useful, super powerful. So I teach testimonials as a tool for my students, as a persuasive tool. And I tell them it is very difficult to argue with somebody else's experience, right? So if we're going to have an ideological conversation about the middle class, we can pull out economics and numbers and facts and everything. But if I tell you about my experience as a middle class person, um, the most that you can say is, well, I haven't had the same experience, but I feel for you, kind of thing. The bad thing about testimonials is that that also makes us vulnerable to manipulation, right? Especially if we identify with the person. So if you have a teenager in your family who all of a sudden needs to use a specific brand of backpack or a specific brand of lipstick, it's very likely that they were influenced by somebody who said that that brand changed their lives, or identifies this brand with this and that. In the past, it used to be celebrities, but now anybody can be as influential as a celebrity. You want to be like that person. There's something that you like or trust about them, and that makes their story a lot more relatable to you and a lot more persuasive.
Yeah, we've certainly seen the rise of influencers, haven't we? And how do you think influencers affect propaganda, misinformation, whatever? What's the role or the effect of influencers today?
Go for it, Maria.
I mean, they've changed the way that we communicate completely. I'm trying to think about how many times I've found something that is newsworthy through TikTok, which I use for entertainment. I don't use it as my news source, but I find out about it there and then do my homework, right? And I wonder how many people don't do their homework. Influencers have changed the way in which we obtain and share information. They are not necessarily new. I probably should have started there. I think uh, from the early research, the early 20th century Lippmann opinion leaders are the modern day influencers. I like to tell that to my students because I really want them to learn a little bit of communication and media history. But what is different is how many we have access to today, right? So while our parents and our grandparents had access to a few voices on the radio or on the TV, our children have access to thousands of people that can influence them.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
how do we help them? Go ahead, Renee.
Oh, yeah, influencers are a wonderful topic to study because, um, and Maria, I'm sure you're having the same problem that I am in my teaching. My students don't all consume the same kind of media. So it used to be back in the day, well, before there was cable television, there were only 3 channels. It was easy to find common ground. Then there were 500 channels in the cable television universe. It was harder, but we could still find that common ground. Now, my the boys in my class are watching and experiencing Twitch streamers and influencers completely different than the ones that the young women are. My students really don't have a lot of common ground influencers. And so, as a teacher, what do I do? Right? So, what I do is I create a digital bulletin board and I ask students to identify an influencer they encountered. And then they post that and they explain, I found this person persuasive because blah, 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 right? Or, this person's influenced my thinking about X because of Y. And that has been mind expanding because now students are appreciative of the fact that actually there's much to learn from each other. It expands your sense of like who you can learn from. And I think that influencers, it's a blessing and a curse, right? They're incredibly diverse and they're not always reliable. In fact, I think the most interesting thing about influencers is the way they're changing our ideas about authority and credibility. It used to be that how you defined a credible source was, well, they had a title behind their name, they were an expert in a certain topic, and they got visibility in a mainstream media outlet. That's how we used to define expert, right? But now there's another kind of credibility that's actually kind of displacing expertise because we don't trust experts now, right? Now, someone who seems authentic, right? Someone who seems similar to you, that person resonates as credible. And so the rise of authenticity to displace authority or expertise has real social consequences. And we have to reflect on what some of the dangers of the rise of authenticity are. But actually, it reflects the fact that we're hungry for the real in the unreal realities that represent our life in a digital society.
Well, how do we help people separate, as Maria pointed out with testimonials, we're all have a tendency not to doubt another person's experience. If for no other reason, it seems impolite to doubt that. So how do we help people decipher whether influencers have a leg to stand on, so to speak? What tools are there available for people to better interpret?
Yeah, yeah. I guess we'll go tag team one and the other. You go first, Maria. What's some advice you have for how to do that? We'll go back and forth a few times.
The first thing that I always think of is you kind of choose your battles, because I do think it requires time and research. So what I mean by choose your battles is you're going to hear some people give a very persuasive argument about something that really isn't important, right? So why you should drink this bottled water versus this other one. At the end of the day, they're both bottled waters. But you're also going to hear people telling you something that is super important. And that's when you need to stop and do your homework, do your original research. Um, I've had these conversations, for example, with one of my nephews when he was in elementary school. One of his teachers, who I'm going to assume is vegan, told him that milk causes cancer. And we were having a walk in the park, and I almost had a heart attack. Because for me, it was everything from where's the research to back that up to, even if that were true, kind of like the economic consequence, all that, big picture thing. But my poor nephew was 9 years old and he didn't want to drink his milk. So for him, it wasn't such a big deal. I think you have to look at the value of the claim, consider how important it is to you, and if it isn't, and if it is important to you, and if it is persuasive to you, then kind of pause and look for additional information before you make any decision based on that.
Nice. Okay, so choose your battles and do your research. Those are two good pieces of advice. I'll add one more. I recognize that I am vulnerable to persuasion when it triggers certain of my deepest fears, hopes, and dreams. And so I have to adopt a stance of intellectual humility toward almost everything, right? I have to try to be really aware of my own biases and notice when my tendency to believe stuff that confirms what I already believe, God, that feels so good. And when I feel that feeling, I have to destabilize myself a little bit and say, Renee, you know, this could be a trap, right? This could lead to shortcomings in my own thinking. So being aware of your own biases and adopting a stance that I might be wrong is a really healthy stance in today's world because it prevents people from getting defensive, right? And it also actually activates intellectual curiosity. Like it makes you want to go do your homework, like what Maria suggested. So we've got choose your battles, do your homework, and like be humble about the limitations of your own knowledge and understanding. Three good pieces of advice. Do we have any others?
Those sounded good.
The Greeks told us that persuasive stuff comes in threes. So having three, well, you know, that's just good.
They also say put 3 bullet points on your PowerPoint. So there you go.
Exactly.
Um, I want to talk about conspiracy theories because that kind of ups the ante a little bit from influencers. Um, Renee, you wrote in your book Mind Over Media, which I'll put in the chat because I highly recommend it. That people will have a tendency to prefer simple solutions and identify villains, and many people also enjoy feeling they have secret knowledge only shared by a few. That just seems intrinsically true, you know, that statement. So when people have so little time, you know, we're all really busy. It gets to like, when do you choose your battles and do your homework? But it seems like the outcomes are so much worse with conspiracy theories, and we've all beat our heads up against a wall with people who believe them. Any advice for us headbangers because we're so frustrated with people who believe in conspiracy theories?
You know, it is a fascinating topic. And I started teaching about conspiracy theories to kids in middle school and high school way more than 15 years ago because, well, actually, they're super entertaining, aren't they? So part of what makes us vulnerable to conspiracy theories is they're so hilarious. Even back in the 90s, when media literacy was still in its earliest days, we used to use a BBC news documentary, I'm going to put it in quotes, that proved that the earth was flat. And it used all of the science, I'm again putting that in air quotes, to show the earth was flat. And I'm telling you, this thing looked like a real documentary. And of course, it was done tongue in cheek, but it was incredibly compelling. So we have to own up to the fact that we're attracted to conspiracy theories because they have entertainment value, because they're surprising, they're shocking. Also, they have this villain, this malevolent villain that's hiding things from us. And so it's like catnip to cats. So if you've ever found yourself intrigued by a conspiracy theory, do not beat yourself up over it. It's like they're it's normal for us to be curious about them, and it's normal for us to want to investigate the truth. And so I think that's one thing we have to kind of acknowledge. The other thing I want to point out is that some conspiracy theories turn out to be true. Okay. And one of the most famous examples of that was the conspiracy theory that was circulating in the African American community in Tuskegee about how men were going to the hospital and they were getting treated by doctors, but they weren't getting any better, and they weren't getting any better, and they weren't getting any better. Something's wrong at this hospital. Well, that was talked about by African Americans for years and years and years before a brave journalist stumbled onto the rumors, the conspiracy theories, and investigated and pulled out the paperwork and found out that indeed the government was doing an experiment, letting some African American men be untreated and die from syphilis because they wanted to see the trajectory of the disease. So there was a conspiracy theory that turned out to be true. And so that's another thing to keep in mind, is that sometimes conspiracy theories are crazy and ridiculous, and sometimes they're not. And so that's partly why we need that intellectual humility, right? Because we're not always sure. But I think conspiracy theories turn out to be a really good way to practice critical thinking, to look at source and compare different sources, to line up arguments and understand what counts as evidence, right? To think about what is the nature of a credible source and who gets who we should find more trustworthy. And so in some ways, conspiracy theories are a really great topic to help people unpack those cognitive and critical skills that are needed really to encounter all kinds of messages, not just conspiracy theories, but everything in our environment.
Yeah, conspiracy theories, I have to admit, are outside my area of expertise, although I agree with Renee that they can be very entertaining. In fact, I remember when I only heard the term in the context of Elvis is alive kind of thing, right? But what I do want to mention is that one of the reasons why people believe in conspiracy theories is because it is absolutely true that power affects people access to information, that there's not enough transparency. So inherently, even those of us that live in a democratic society, we know that we don't have all the information. We know that powerful actors act behind the scenes, right? We don't get to see how the sausage is made. So in a way, it is healthy to be suspicious. It is healthy to explore that conspiracy a little bit. What is not healthy is to become a fanatic, to the degree that you can't be persuaded by any rational argument. Um, I've um, I've had conversations, with my sisters in which that intellectual humility has really helped. Kind of like, this does not sound right to me. And then I find out, they were absolutely right. It sounded like a conspiracy theory to me. But I will say what I have heard, and Renee would know better, is that it is very difficult to pull somebody out once they're already kind of like become a fanatic, assume that as part of their identity. Facts don't tend to work at that moment.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'm putting a link to a brand new book that I just absolutely adore, that would be a great to recommend to your public librarian, would be great to do a book study or a book club on. It's called Ghosts of Iron Mountain, The Hoax of the Century, Its Enduring Impact, and What It Reveals About America Today by Phil Tinline. The report from Iron Mountain was a document that started circulating when the Vietnam War was going on. And it basically said, it was like a government report. And it said, it was a secret government report. And it said, actually, we have determined that war is good for the American economy. And so, like, we actually think that, war is really a good thing for America. And it had all of this government evidence to make it look like the government thought war was a good thing. And it was very compelling, and a lot of people believed it. And then 5 years after it was written, the guy who wrote it as a hoax, right? He was a Harper's Magazine editor, writer. He said, "Look, I wrote it. It was goofy. I tricked you all. Ha ha ha." And nobody believed him.
Sorry. It's too funny.
And the hoax lived on. It's got an incredible, it
Wow.
reads like a good detective story, but the implications for today are really interesting because, of course, anti-government activism is rising all over this country, right? And people's distrust of government is corrosive to democracy. And to understand sort of how conspiracy theories and satires and hoax can be understood and manipulated by people for their own propaganda purposes. Rich topic for discussion.
Indeed.
Comfortably enough in the past that we can actually talk about it, right? Where it's a little bit harder to talk about QAnon, if you know what I mean.
Yes, for sure. Yes, it's easier to reflect than to dissect, perhaps. Question for you specifically, Renee, in your book, I didn't realize this, that the Common Core had emphasized argumentation over other forms. And I think that would be interesting to our audience if you could talk to that. I found that very interesting.
Oh, Marilyn, you rock, girl. Let me just give you a big shout out. So thank you for asking that. That's a geeky question, but
Sorry.
it's one of my favorite topics to talk about. So thank you for that. So as part of my research for this book, I had to figure out why. I searched the whole country. I have a network of 10,000 K-12 teachers. I asked them all, who's teaching about propaganda, contemporary propaganda, not like Hitler, not, Nazi propaganda. Who's teaching about contemporary propaganda? I was able to find 60 people in total,
That's it.
right? And I wrote a lot of their stories in the book.
Mhm.
In trying to answer the question, why aren't more teachers teaching about propaganda, given that in the 1930s, every American teacher was teaching about propaganda, right? In the 1930s and in the 1950s, almost all teachers, English teachers, were teaching about propaganda. We can track it and see that it fell off the map. When did it fall off the map? It fell off the map with the Common Core state standards. And the Common Core state standards said basically to teachers, well, persuasion and propaganda, that is like inferior.
Mhm.
And argumentation, ooh, using logic, evidence, and reasoning, that's good. And so they created a hierarchy that said persuading with facts and logic is better than persuading with the heart or with character or charisma. But this hierarchy goes completely against what the Greeks told us 2,500 years ago, right? And so it's like, well, who was this guy who wrote the Common Core to create a hierarchy when we've known since forever, facts don't change
right.
people's minds, feelings do.
Mhm.
We know that those three qualities of persuasion, the Greeks called them logos, logical thinking, ethos, emotional reasoning, emotional response, and pathos, logos, and ethos. Ethos is charisma. We know all three of those are important for persuasion. Why focus on only one? And it turns out that, well, I guess you're probably not surprised. Teachers are afraid of feelings. And teachers are a little bit afraid of this phenomenon of charisma. Charisma itself is kind of hard to pin down, isn't it? How we're attracted by somebody's like way of being. And we find them persuasive because of the way of being, right? Effective communicators have charisma that makes us want to believe them. So once those topics, emotion and charisma, got taken off the table, well, kids came out of high school like unprepared to think about how emotion is being used to persuade them, how charisma is being used to persuade them. So fear of teaching about the persuasive genres is a reality we have to confront in this country. And right now, whew, teachers' fear is at an all-time high. Like
Interesting.
they're petrified, even to bring a opinion piece from the newspaper into the classroom, or a social media influencer. So teachers are afraid to teach the persuasive genres, which then feeds on itself because now we have kids coming out of high school who are exposed to more persuasion than at any point in human history, but have no
Tools.
competencies
Yeah.
to make sense of it.
That's powerful, Renee. I'm just looking at the clock. I have more questions I could ask, but I bet our audience members here have a lot of provocative questions. So it's who's got a question for Renee and Maria?
Questions or comments?
Oh, comments too?
Sure. How do these ideas resonate with your lived experience?
Linda.
Yes, long time back, because I've been retired and taught in years, mostly at the collegiate level, but I did teach in a couple of high schools, and in one particular high school in Knox County, at that time they had an elective system for English classes, and so I was interested in media. And so I wrote a semester course at that time using the Knoxville News Sentinel at that time would furnish me with 35 copies of the newspaper every day. And I found out that I could teach an amazing number of things with that newspaper. But one of the key things that I found in teaching about propaganda and other things is the use of words, connotation, denotation, the subtleties. And I used to use an example in my class. I said, if you were written up in the newspaper, a policeman had stopped you for driving erratically and you were reported as being, would you rather be drunk or inebriated? Just as a simple example there. And how looking at copy and looking at the word choice, sometimes we ask ourselves, why do people have to be identified by their race? Was a black person or a white person or whatever it may be. But the language, I feel, is at the key of things. If they cannot understand the subtleties of language and how they can be manipulated with it, I think that's at the heart of understanding.
Boy, Linda, you are so right. And that's why when we try to explain media literacy, we say it's literacy, because understanding the power of language and being able to deploy the power of language is what makes you literate, right? So a beautiful example, and rock on for newspaper and education programs. It's such a pity that they don't exist anymore, although there is a form of news literacy that's gaining a lot of traction in American public schools now. So it's back in a different way. But boy, you're right. Every English teacher appreciates how news media and media in general give us opportunities for students to appreciate the power of language.
Thank you. We have a question from Catherine. Catherine, I'm going to read your question unless you want to come on screen and ask it yourself.
Yeah.
How should we think about propaganda? It's hard to get out that propaganda is bad mentality. You sort of addressed that earlier, but I think it's still a lingering question.
It's super, super important. Maria, if we think about propaganda as public relations and as activism, we think about how activists create propaganda, and that can sometimes help dislodge people's thinking about propaganda is bad. How do you help your students understand the social benefits of public relations or propaganda?
Oh, I was gonna say, I help my students I do not help my students understand the social benefit of propaganda, to tell you the truth. We still use it as a bad word.
Okay.
If I am teaching a graduate class, my conversation is a lot more nuanced, more like how you explained it.
Hmm.
If I'm teaching an undergraduate class, those that are going to be technicians, not strategists, not a strategist, what I want them to know is this is what I don't want you to do. And most of that is labeled as propaganda, right? So in my experience, it is okay to understand propaganda as a bad term. What is not okay then is to think that every strategic communication effort is propaganda.
Mm.
But the best way to understand it is that um, it really depends on the intent and the tools used. I like to think of these like I give my students the example of a needle or a knife, right? You can use them for very practical things or you can use them to hurt people. And that's one of the difficulties differentiating propaganda from good uses of strategic communication or bad propaganda, I should specify. And it is that the tools look the same, especially if you don't have good literacy, especially if it's a topic that you don't know about, right? So imagine that there's a propaganda video showing you this society that you've never heard about before in the past. You will have no or very little ability to discern what is credible and what isn't. And that is the big problem because it looks credible. It is very easy that that's going to influence the way that you think about that group far, far away.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think I definitely am aware that it's an uphill battle to dislodge people's stereotypes about propaganda equals bad. One of the ways I like to think about it, and I try to help my students think about it, is that everyone who creates a message puts in a lot of time and talent to craft it, right? They think strategically about the words and the pictures and the message and the audience. That's what you do if you're attentive as a communicator. You think about what your message is. And so for every piece of propaganda that exists, somebody thought it was a good idea to put out there, right? And that means we kind of have to sort of respect the fact that we can assess propaganda's impact and consequences only in relation to individuals and society, benefits and harms. Propaganda can be beneficial to some people and harmful to other people, right? So there's a lot of nuance in thinking about social impact of propaganda. That's why I like to say propaganda is in the eye of the beholder.
I agree.
Because you might see that press release from Palantir as absolute cryptocurrency propaganda, right? They're
Right.
trying to push cryptocurrency, and this is just them really selling this terrible, terrible product. Well, I might see that same press release as actually really beneficial in helping make good decisions about where should I put my investments. And we're both right. So that's another place where intellectual humility comes into play, that when we open our minds to the fact that propaganda may be beneficial and harmful to different audiences and different contexts, then that keeps me from doing something that I'm really keen on as a media literacy educator. I'm trying to slow down people's judgments and interpretations. I don't want somebody to have a knee-jerk reaction, see a political message flash on their social media screen and go, oh, that's propaganda, and
Right.
just dismiss it. No, actually, I want them to take time to actually look at it and ask, who's the author and what's the purpose? What are they doing to hold my attention? How does this message align with my values? How might different people interpret it differently? And what are they leaving out? And so when I slow down to take media messages seriously, then that's really media literacy. Because too often, if I label it bad, it's propaganda bad, I don't have to do any critical thinking about it. And I've
Right.
just bypassed the opportunity to actually have a deeper encounter with a media message that I actually, if I look at it more carefully, I might actually find some benefit there.
The taking more time or not having the time or not taking the time makes us much more vulnerable to things like memes that often use a celebrity who didn't even necessarily say the thing. Like I see Sam Elliott a lot. Yeah, I think he's cute. Maybe that's why I see him. I don't know. Anyway, I don't know how I was targeted specifically, but I was. So, how do we help people? I will. I'm sort of on a rampage, and when a friend of mine puts a meme up, and I go do the research, and I come back and I tell them privately, not true. Please take that down. But how do we give people the tools to overcome the memification of our communication? Anyone? Anyone?
I think the word overcome is
Too
maybe
ambitious?
yeah, a little bit. I think what is very cool and useful is to have conversations. I like the idea of coffee discussions, kind of like book clubs, kind of discussions about these topics, because we are going to be influenced socially. And having that opportunity to learn from each other and listen from it and listen is such a good exercise that even if we're talking about a meme, I remember the memes with Hillary Clinton on a plane and she had glasses. These were years ago, and they would put bubbles. I did not care what the content was. I thought it was hilarious. Right? The bubbles could have said, I loved cats, and I thought it was hilarious. There are just some memes that are going to speak to you. And that's okay. What is not okay is not having that longer discussion, that longer conversation. And I think maybe I'm romanticizing the idea of, coffee conversations, but I think we should make time for a lot more of those.
Okay, that is so right, Maria. I'm just going to amplify that very point, but I'm also going to teach you a technique that you can use with your best friend, your husband, your wife, your neighbor, your granddaughter, anybody. Okay, here's how it works. Because you'll see this, how easy it is to disrupt. Okay, you see somebody and they're doing this, right? With their device. Foof, 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 foof. Because people do that in between things, right? You're with a group, but somebody just is over there going foof, 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 foof. You go right up over them, look over their shoulder, and you're watching them foof, foof, foof. And then you call out one. Wait a sec. Hold on. What was that one you just passed by? Let's go back. Could you go back to that? I would like to look at that more. And they go back and they're like, what? And then you go back to it and then you look at it and you go, whoa, um, I see. And then you just describe what you see. And that makes me feel X. What do you see? And how does it make you feel? And they say, I see blah, 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 and it makes me feel blah, 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 right? And then you say, who made that message? And they're like, huh? Right? And then it turns out now you have to take an extra step, right? You got to go click on the name of the author. You got to figure out who that is. And then there's another conversation. What do you see? How does it make you feel? What do you see? How does it make you feel? Turns out that disrupting the click and swipe cycle is super entertaining, fun, and a learning experience. Because if you do this with your granddaughter, you're going to see, whoa, she interprets these messages really differently than you, and she's getting a different emotional jolt than you are. But, you've got something to say about that experience. And if you do it with a girlfriend or a peer or a coworker, it can actually get deep in a beautiful way. And because I do it a lot now, all of my friends already like expect me to do it all the time now. But they say things like, now I am less, I'm slower
Mhm.
sometimes. Now I am slower sometimes. So sometimes disrupting the click swipe cycle just requires you getting in there and asking people questions about their feelings, about their interpretations, about the sense making that's going on, and about the pleasure of these messages. So that's an inroad to media literacy that you can do, from the comfort of your nearby relationships with people in your life. And it works.
Terrific. I want to just see if anyone else in our audience has any questions, anything that you came in here on your mind that you feel maybe is unanswered, hasn't been asked, or that you're just curious about. Let's see. Someone's getting having some optimism about how to treat their 13-year-old. That's very good, Candace. That's good to read. All right. Well, I'm just going to leave with one last question for you both, because it was the last question that we talked about we might discuss. Or what is examples of I'll say ethical, positive, good, persuasive techniques that the League of Women Voters can use to provide objective and unbiased perspective and not just trot out a bunch of facts because we know people won't necessarily read them. What would you recommend to us?
Maria.
I like education, entertainment education. I really like it. I like those comedy skits, music, theater that is made in a way that educates because it lowers the barrier of entry, right? If you invite to a conversation, let's talk about democracy and its challenges in the 21st century. I'm like, holy cow, I have to do my homework before I come versus, let's watch a play about the suffragettes, which I love. There's a musical that I watched in Chicago a while ago. And that's a wonderful point of entrance to a topic. So I really think in advocacy, entertainment, as long, of course, as it's based on good information, valid information, proven information can be very, very valuable.
Hmm. Hmm. That's a pretty good thing. What can the League of Women Voters do to use persuasive strategies that help people do civic engagement better?
Well
I
said.
I think that I want to go back to this: facts don't change people's minds, feelings do. Right? Right now, I think people are overwhelmed, right? They're discouraged, they're fatigued, they're exhausted, they're overwhelmed, right? I think the job of sense making has gotten harder than ever. And because of political polarization, there are risks, right, that are keeping people from civic engagement. So I have found that with adults, visible displays of care and compassion for people who you radically disagree with can be so very, very powerful. It turns out that I don't have to agree with you to find you a lovable, capable, and beautiful person. And when I don't have to try to persuade you, is actually when I can open up my ears. There's a wonderful book. It's called High Conflict by Amanda Ripley. And Amanda Ripley discovered that when people feel heard, then they can listen to others. So, what could the League of Women Voters do to bring people toward civic engagement? They could engage in the deep, compassionate act of listening with respect to people whose views are really different from their own. And in doing that, that opens up the possibility of people acknowledging their own limitations of their own knowledge and opening up the possibility that, I believe this, but I only believe this 90%. I might be wrong. And when I can acknowledge that I might be wrong, Now I want to hear your point of view. I want to learn from you. So compassionate listening with an open heart opens the possibility of depolarization. And we need that so bad right now. And in Tennessee, that could be the secret that brings people together across our differences politically. Listening with an open heart, activities that involve listening with an open heart. Braver Angels is a great group for that, but there are others, many others that are terrific at teaching people about listening across the political divide.
Terrific. Well, we have come to the hour that, and if no one has any further questions, I'm just going to ask everyone to offer some applause and say thank you for your excellent, open-minded and spirited conversation here. I really appreciate you both, and we all do, and look forward to the recording and to share with your friends, for those who couldn't attend. And again, thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you so much.